Okay, this is AC 4.1, assess the use of criminological theories in informing policy development. As I've gone through all the different criminological theories with you, I have introduced the idea of how these theories might have informed policy development. In some of my PowerPoints, I've looked at things like eugenics, zero tolerance policies, etc., and talked about those in quite considerable detail. But what I'm looking at specifically in this PowerPoint, so it's much shorter than the others, is the strengths and weaknesses of these policies. So this allows you to then assess. So for more details, you're going to need to go and look back at the previous PowerPoints when I've looked at this specific AC, but this PowerPoint is just dealing with the strengths and weaknesses. Now, not all the theories we've looked at will necessarily have informed policy development, but hopefully I've divided this up into different brackets for you. Hopefully it will all make sense. So let's make a start. We'll start with biological theories. So if we're looking at biochemical theories, things like drug treatments, so we could argue that alcohol and drug addiction treatments have been used successfully to reduce criminality, so that's a big plus. Sedatives and tranquilizers have been successfully used to calm troublesome or violent prisoners, so that is also a success story. At the same time, biological treatments such as chemical castration have had some effect in successfully reducing the sexual urges of offenders. And other chemicals such as tear gas have been used to successfully control crowds or disperse rioters. However, if we're going to look at the downside of some of these, chemical castration, for instance, can have serious side effects such as breast development, feminization, psychiatric disorders, etc. So that's a downside of this type of treatment. And tear gas has been known to cause lung damage and in some extreme cases even death. So again, a downside to that use of a biochemical policy. If we go to eugenics, very hard for me to see any positives in eugenics whatsoever, so I'm just going for downsides here. You can look at it in more detail in the previous PowerPoints, but eugenics has been used to justify atrocities such as the Nazis' extermination of the physically and mentally disabled and the genocide of supposedly inferior races such as the Jews. And it's been used to justify policies such as compulsory sterilisation, forced abortions and restrictions on the right to marry. So it's very hard to see how this can ever be acceptable in a free democratic society. So eugenics, utterly unacceptable. And there's little else more we can do on biological theories. So we then move on to individualistic theories. So if we look at psychoanalysis, well, it doesn't seem very effective. ICENC found that 44% of psychoanalysis patients treated for neurosis showed improvement, but that was compared to 72% of patients treated by hospitals or GPs. So therefore, if psychoanalysis doesn't work for neurosis, it seems unlikely to work for criminals who ICENC argued were likely to be neurotics. Also, psychoanalysis is costly and time consuming, so it's never been used on a large scale for treating criminals. And the nature of psychoanalysis creates a power imbalance between therapist and client that could raise ethical issues. So there's little positive when you're assessing psychoanalysis. When we look at policies such as token economies, strengths of that are that some studies show an improvement in behaviour, and that's particularly when the offender is in prison. So as we know from that study of token economies, it did appear to be successful in those Alabama houses. Again, you need to go back and look at that detail in the previous PowerPoints on this. But, and it's a big but, when the offender leaves prison, the positive behaviours tend to disappear because there are no reinforcers there. However, offenders return to crime more slowly compared with those who've not undergone the token economy program. So you could argue that is a minor plus there. At the same time, there's been criticism of some use of token economies, particularly in the USA, where food or drink were being withheld and used as rewards. Well, critics have argued that these are a human right and not a privilege to be earned. Moving on, if we continue with our individualistic theories, we've looked at aversion therapy. Well, there's little positives to be looked at for aversion therapy. It's had very limited success. It's usually only short term, and its use in attempting to cure gay people has been criticised as a human rights abuse, and absolutely rightly so. Moving on, we look at cognitive behavioural therapy. Now, I haven't done this in much detail in previous slides, so I'm going to spend a bit more time on this. Cognitive behavioural therapy, CBTs, they've been applying to a range of offender treatment programs, and what they're aiming to do is change offenders' thoughts and attitudes so that in that way their behaviour is then changed. So a couple of examples of these that we use in the UK were the Think First programme, which is a group one-to-one session for repeat offenders on probation, aiming to enable offenders to control their thoughts and feelings and behaviour. And so it's teaching things like problem-solving skills, consequential thinking, in other words, thinking about what the consequences of your actions are. It's teaching decision-making, seeing things from other people's points of view, so empathy, and it also provides social interaction and moral reasoning training. Positives of this are that those completing the programme are 30% less likely to be reconvicted than offenders who receive an alternative community service. So that's definitely a good thing. But, and there's always a but with these things, the non-completion rates on the programme are often quite high, so offenders don't always complete the programmes. Carrying on with cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT, another programme that we use in this country is aggression replacement training, ART, and that's a programme for violent or aggressive offenders, and that involves interpersonal skills training through things such as role play, anger control techniques, dealing with emotions, providing offenders with alternative courses of action instead of violence, moral reasoning training that challenges their attitudes by confronting them with moral dilemmas to consider. Positive sides of this, evaluations do mostly show much lower conviction rates if ART has been undertaken. But some evaluations have found that although the thinking skills of the offenders have improved, actually their behaviour hasn't. That then moves us on to sociological theories. And basically, if you're looking at Durkheim or Merton or left realism, any policies that tackle inequality, such as welfare policies, fair wages, job security, education for all, including education in prison, any policy such as that, well, there's strong evidence that shows that all anti-poverty policies have a positive effect in reducing criminality. It's absolutely obvious that societies that spend more on welfare jail fewer people. So those with greater equality, like the USA, have higher crime rates. If we carry on with that and look at labelling theory, which argues for decriminalisation, diversion policies, reintegrated shaming, etc. Again, information on those are in the previous PowerPoints. Well, evidence shows that crime control policies based on labelling theory can deal successfully with minor offences and young offenders, because it avoids labelling people as criminals and keeps them out of the justice system and avoids pushing them into a deviant career. If we then look at right realism, we looked in our previous slide shows that situational crime prevention, SCP. Well, target hardening definitely makes it harder for criminals to commit crime in an area where targets have been hardened. It's hard to argue otherwise. But a problem with situational crime prevention is that if, as right realists argue, criminals act rationally, then if they find a target too hard to crack, they'll simply look for a softer one. So that means that, for example, they may commit a crime at a different time or a different place, or use a different method or choose a different target. And that then can result in more vulnerable targets, such as the old, the poor or disabled, being victimised more because other targets have been hardened. Again, I'm just duplicating stuff here that I put in previous PowerPoints, but it just sums it up nicely. Carrying on with right realism, with zero tolerance policing, well, we know that crime fell after zero tolerance policing was introduced in New York in the 1990s, but the fall in crime in New York may have been due to other factors, because other US cities that had not adopted zero tolerance policing also saw crime fell. Some studies have shown that ZTP curfews can actually increase juvenile crime, because if you remove the law-abiding youths from the streets, that leaves them emptier and more favourable to crime. Also, zero tolerance policing can lead to targeting ethnic minorities due to police racism, and to confrontations due to heavy-handed military policing. And finally, both ZTP and indeed SCP as well, so you can add this to the previous slide if you want, fail to tackle those structural causes of crime such as inequality. Also, they focus on low-level street crime, and they ignore the crimes of the powerful, which is white-collar and state crime. So those changes to the system, fair wages, equal opportunities, etc., are not part of ZTP and SCP. And my final slide on this AC, penal populism, in other words, increasing the numbers in prison. Well, you could argue that bunging people in prison works temporarily because offenders can't commit crimes against the public while they're in jail, so that's a strong argument. But the reality is, if you bump the numbers up in prison and keep bumping them up, then and you don't invest in it, and at the moment we're not investing in it, budget cuts mean that prisoners lack access to education, skills training or treatment programs, which therefore prevents them from becoming law-abiding citizens on release. And that is echoed in the fact that imprisonment appears to be completely ineffective in reducing repeat offending recidivism. 48% of adults in the UK are reconvicted within a year of release. So that seems to indicate that prison is not working. And that is also backed up by the fact that imprisonment, which right realists argue should be a deterrent, doesn't actually deter offenders enough to affect overall crime rates. So hopefully you found that useful. I've just tried to crystallise everything to make it easier for you. But if you want more info on any of these policies, go back and look at the previous PowerPoints. Thank you. Goodbye.